Well, hello there. Today we're going to be looking at the relationship between theology and science, and specifically as it relates to the Christian doctrine of creation and the scientific theory of evolution. We'll see where these two different understandings might work together, where they are different from each other, and if there are areas in which they're in conflict with each other. Now, the best way into this topic is through this very helpful little text by Pope John Paul II. It was written in 1996, called A Message to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences on Evolution. Pope John Paul was a philosopher by training and a theologian by profession, and so he's very good at making careful distinctions between what scientific enterprises do and what theologians do, and to understand how they might work together and to understand the differences between them. We might start out today by asking something that I think a lot of Christians implicitly may sense. That is, that science is somehow a threat to Christianity. So we ask, is it true? Is science as an intellectual enterprise a threat to Christianity? And the answer here has to be, as we'll see, absolutely not. If we understand what scientists are doing and what they're not doing, and if we understand what theologians are doing and what they're not doing. Let's try to figure out what each one of them does. What does scientists do and what do scientists not do? Well, scientists work within models of truth, have a big picture understanding of how things ought to work, and then they work and make hypotheses within that. They do experiments according to method. Experiment is able to hold up under testing, or if it's not. Now, the second point is very important here for our purposes. The discipline of science looks only at natural objects and gives only natural explanations. That means that scientists are not answering every kind of question. They're only answering questions about natural things, questions that can be tested in a particular way, can be falsified through particular experiments. Now, what then does theology do and not do? Well, theology is driven by revelation. That's its first source. And Christians understand the fullness of revelation to be Jesus Christ as a person. Our faith is in a person, and there's a witness to revelation, which is the Bible, that Christians take seriously. And so then it tries to make sense of everything in reality in light of Jesus Christ. Here then, theologians are doing something much bigger than what scientists are doing. They are not limiting themselves to natural objects. They're not limiting themselves then to the questions of science. Rather, they're incorporating truth of all kinds, trying to understand it in light of Jesus Christ. So all truth from everywhere is always of interest to Christianity. What we notice here is that science is a particular mode of inquiry. That's really the essence of what it is. It's a way of looking at things, and it's a limitation of the things it looks at. To natural objects, and we expect natural kinds of experiments and natural answers, and only those kinds. Science then works on what's called methodological naturalism. It restricts itself to natural explanations. It is, in that sense, a legitimate and limited method of inquiry. It plays by particular rules. It doesn't go outside those rules so that it can accomplish something with the rules that it has. Now, let's think of the example of this chess set down below. If you're playing chess, you know that you have to play according to certain rules. If the rook could do anything, then we couldn't have a game of chess. If the pawn could move anywhere, then it would be impossible to play the game of chess. If that game of chess is going to be played, a set of rules must limit what the different parts can do so that the game will be able to progress. That's what's going on with science. It chooses a particular process, a naturalistic process. It asks questions about natural objects, and in so doing, it accomplishes something great. It achieves very precise and careful measurements on natural objects. It produces truth in that way. Now, let's consider the category next to it. That is scientism. Scientism is a very different thing. Scientism assumes that only nature exists. That is, it not only decides to play within the rules of assuming that we only talk about natural objects, it's made a bigger move. It says that only natural objects exist. You can see then that scientism is a belief system, that there's nothing beyond nature. It's a worldview. It's a religion of sorts. It's making a big claim that there's absolutely nothing beyond the world of nature. Anything that goes beyond, such as God, needs to be disproven because there can't be such a thing. Now, as you can see, that's a big step beyond what science does, and I need to explain a little bit more what this belief system of scientism is. And what we'll see is that it's often scientism as a belief system rather than science as a mode of inquiry that creates tension between Christianity and scientific experiments. Now, I've described scientism as something of a worldview, almost a religion. And so I need to explain the tenets of this worldview or this religion a little bit more to show why it is scientism and not science that's in conflict with Christianity. Scientism is an atheistic worldview that holds the following 5 propositions. The first 3 are very old. The ancient Greeks, I believe, held these first 3. The last 2 are very new, and they've only originated in the last 100 or so years. So first, apart from nature, there is nothing. Well, of course, there couldn't be. If the only thing that exists is nature, natural stuff, then there couldn't be anything outside of that. The universe is what is. Whatever is outside of it must be natural things, say scientism, because there's only one kind of thing, and that's nature. Premise 2 is obvious from the first one. Nature must be self-originating. It couldn't be otherwise because, well, if there's nature, and nature is all that there is, there's no God or anything, then of course nature must be self-originating. Whatever we see in our natural world must have come from nature itself. The third is that the universe has no inherent purpose. There's no intrinsic or inherent reason for the universe to be, and so there is no purpose that it's moving toward. Of course, here, individuals might choose purposeful things for their lives. We might choose to take this occupation or choose to be happy in this way. Individuals make those choices, but the universe as a whole doesn't have an inherent purpose toward which it's moving because it's simply blind chance that exists on its own. It has no consciousness, it simply is. Now, the last 2 premises are relatively new, and they show up amongst the new atheists in their strongest form. The fourth one, science is the only means to knowledge. Now, that's quite a big claim. That is, that ultimately science can answer all the questions of reality. It follows from premise 1, of course, if nature is all that there is, and science is our best way of getting at natural processes and natural occurrences, then it would seem that science is the best means to answer all questions in life. And so there are some atheists today who are saying that science is the only way to answer the world's questions of all kinds. The fifth point here is that all features of living things can be explained through Darwinian theory. Darwinian theory here has become a holistic system, the explanation for everything. Now, I mention this here to show that oftentimes Christians think that there's some kind of a conflict between science and religion. It's not so. What we see here is that it's scientism, a worldview, a quasi-religion of sorts, an atheistic way of looking at all reality. It sees itself, and it is, fully opposed to Christianity. But here it's the worldview, and not particularly the method of inquiry, which is scientific research, that is the threat. So let's appreciate the cartoon on the left here. The scientist says to the other scientist working out a problem, I think you should be a little more explicit in step 2, where scientist 1 has said, a miracle occurs here. You can see that in the game of science, that would be an illegal move to propose a miracle. Scientists are supposed to ask questions about nature. They're supposed to provide explanations only through nature, and they limit their conclusions then to natural objects and natural processes and natural conclusions. That's absolutely legitimate for the field of science. It's exactly what we would hope that they would do, and they've made great gains by limiting their field of inquiry to that. However, it would be a jump from science to scientism to claim the only explanations for anything in the world are natural or naturalistic ones. So while we would expect the scientist not to pose a miracle in step 2, the scientist does not rule out the possibility that there could be miracles. The scientist simply works with the assumption that he's going to look at natural explanations and natural explanations only. So we finally then get to the important question for our study today. What should scientists do and say about the origin and development of life? Should it be off limits for the scientist to ask about the origin of life? Of course not. The scientists should do these things. They should provide well-researched, natural, possible explanations for the origin of life and the development of life using only natural sources. We would not expect the scientist to say something about God. We would not respect him as a scientist if he were to do that. The scientist must play within the bounds of its discipline, asking only natural questions and proposing only natural solutions. But of course, the scientist does not make a claim and say that's the only possible answer, or I have the full answer here. So a scientist should not claim that the only natural explanations could be the full explanation. To do that, it would be a jump from science to scientism. With all that background in mind, let's go straight to the document itself, and we'll start with paragraph 2, middle of the first page. I'm delighted, Pope John Paul says, with the theme in which you have chosen, the origin of life and evolution. He's speaking here to a group of scientists, and their study during this week-long seminar is going to be on evolution and the origin of life. And so he praises them for choosing that. It's an essential theme of lively interest to the church, he says, since Revelation contains some of its own teachings concerning the nature and origins of man. Now the key question, how should the conclusions reached by the diverse scientific disciplines be brought together with those contained in the message of Revelation? What he's saying is important because we would expect a scientist asking natural and only natural kinds of questions and doing natural experiments, reaching natural conclusions, to have somewhat different data from that which the Bible may tell us, what we've learned from God. And so we would expect there to be differences. How might we reconcile those differences between these two very different modes of approach? His answer is important. First, he says, at first glance, it may seem like these views will clash with each other. How then should we look for a solution? We know, he says, and this is the first point, that truth cannot contradict truth. That's useful because what he's saying is whatever the answer that scientists get and whatever the answer given in the pages of Revelation, whatever truth there is there, it cannot contradict truth, even if it looks somewhat different at the beginning, if indeed both have accessed truth. We turn then to paragraph 3 for the next point. Go to that little paragraph that says, for my part, when I received the participants in the plenary assembly of your academy on October 31st, 1992, I used that occasion and the example of Galileo to draw attention to the necessity of bringing a rigorous hermeneutical approach in seeking a concrete interpretation of the inspired texts. Now, this is important because the Pope is recognizing Christians have often seen problems where there aren't problems. They've often thought there was conflict when there may not have been conflict. Galileo proposed that the earth goes around the sun rather than the sun going around the earth. And the church was very defensive, and the church put Galileo under house arrest and told him to stop writing. You'll notice then the church had created a crisis where there didn't need to be a crisis. In fact, very soon afterwards, most everyone began to realize that yes, the earth goes around the sun. That's the better way to see the relationship between the two. And Christianity did not die. It simply revised its understanding of certain texts, which claim that the sun rises and the sun sets. That's a human way of looking at things. That's what it looks like to us, the church said. And so they began to read those passages a little bit differently, but recognized that there was no fundamental conflict. This might need to happen sometimes, Pope John Paul II says. It's important to set proper limits to the understanding of Scripture, excluding any unseasonable interpretations which would make it mean something which it is not intended to mean. In order to mark out the limits of their own proper fields, theologians and those working on the exegesis of Scripture need to be well informed regarding the results of the latest scientific research. So the church needs possible correction in its reading of Scripture. It's possible. And we've seen it many, many, many times in history where the church thinks that a particular reading is the truth, but in fact it may be an inadequate reading. There might be something more true that could be added. There might be a different interpretation that needs to be given so that that passage can be better understood and more fully understood. That's what the Pope is getting at here. Christians should never rule out the possibility that science has something to offer in helping us to read our texts better. In fact, Christians should be eager for that kind of correction where it might come. Doesn't mean that they automatically change their view of the text anytime there's new scientific data. It means that they're genuine truth seekers willing to investigate the truth of those claims in light of the Scriptures. And the third thing that the Pope says is that we need to be careful not to give too much or too little credit to the theory of evolution here. Evolution is, in fact, a theory. It's not something that's been proven. It is a meta-scientific model, which means that it can't be proven. And so it's only as good as the facts that it bears out. Look at the last few lines here, the last paragraph of this page. What is the significance of a theory such as this one? To open this question is to enter into the field of epistemology, because it's a scientific model. A theory is a meta-scientific elaboration, which is distinct from, but in harmony with, results of observation. With the help of such a theory, a group of data and independent facts can be related to each other and interpreted in one comprehensive explanation. The theory, any scientific theory, proves its validity by the measure to which it can be verified. It is constantly being tested by the facts. When it can no longer explain these facts, it shows its limits and its lack of usefulness, and it must be revised. So any model like evolution is only as good as the facts that it produces. If those facts show it to be false, then it cannot be held any longer in a credible way, at least without significant modification. Here in paragraph 4, we might notice that the church gives evolution quite a bit of credibility, as I suppose it should. Way back in 1950, with the document Humani Generis, Pope Pius XII had already said that evolution is a serious hypothesis, worthy of investigation and serious study alongside other hypotheses. And, he added, one could not set aside the teaching of revelation on irrelevant questions either. So already he's emphasized that it's a worthy scientific pursuit. Here in 1996, Pope John Paul is saying something even more. He's saying today, half a century after the appearance of that encyclical, some new findings lead us toward the recognition of evolution as more than a hypothesis. He's using technical language here. It moves from hypothesis to something more established, which is a theory. In fact, it is remarkable that this theory has progressively greater influence on the spirit of researchers following a series of discoveries in different scholarly disciplines. So he's saying the evidence continues to show the relevance of this theory. This model seems to be backed up by data in ways that no other model right now seems to be backed up by. It seems to account for the best number of observations that we've made about the world, and it seems to have predictive value. It seems to be able to show what we'll find in particular places, and then those things seem to be confirmed by the research. But it's, remember, only a scientific model, and therefore only as good as the evidence that can be shown by it. Paragraph 4 finishes by giving a very useful insight about where conflict comes from when there seems to be conflict between science and religion. Pope John Paul II says this, and to tell the truth, rather than speaking of the theory of evolution, it's more accurate to speak of theories of evolution. Theories in the plural. The use of the plural is required here, in part because of the diversity of explanations regarding the mechanism of evolution, and in part because of the diversities of philosophies involved. There are materialist and reductionist theories, and there are spiritualist theories. Understand well the difference here. There are materialist and reductionist theories, those driven by scientism, that says this is the only explanation for something. When we see the origin of life, it must have a purely natural cause. And then there are spiritualist theories, those that say, well, that we see the origin of life, and it's very reasonable to assume that that life was given by God, and where we see the development of life along the way, it's very compatible to believe that that life is also being developed by God, so God is working along with nature. Notice both of those evolutionary theories. One is a case of scientism, proposing merely naturalistic explanations, and the other is a legitimate, perhaps Christian perspective, which suggests that God is the source, support, and end of all things. Remember the distinction between science and scientism. Science limits the nature of its answers because it says we're only dealing with natural observations, and so of course there could be other, perhaps supernatural explanations for things as well. Scientism is inherently materialistic, inherently naturalistic. It says we've found through science the complete answer for something, and that is where there would be conflict. In paragraph 5, the Pope explains why the theory of evolution is and will always be so important to the Church. The magisterium of the Church takes a direct interest in the question of evolution because it touches on the conception of man, whom Revelation tells us is created in the image and likeness of God. Very clearly, then, whatever the theory of evolution tells us about the origin of human beings and the development of human beings and the way in which human beings are or are not related to animals, we must be able to preserve the idea that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. The creation stories tell that directly to us. The human person cannot be subordinated as a means to an end or as an instrument of either the species or society. The human being has a value of his own. The human being has intelligence and will and is capable of entering into relationship, communion, solidarity, the gift of himself to others like himself, community. Thomas observed that the man's resemblance to God resides especially in his speculative intellect, because his relationship with the object of his knowledge is like God's relationship with his creation. But even beyond that, Man is called to enter into a loving relationship with God himself, a relationship which will find its full expression at the end of time in eternity. A human being has, in a few lines down, an eternal soul. And the risen Christ will bring that eternal soul into relationship with himself for all eternity. There is much in the Christian understanding of a human being that could never be accessed through science. And whatever we say about a scientific model like evolution, it must be compatible with a Christian understanding of the human being. Is there any way of finding common ground between the theory of evolution, which describes the gradual progress of creatures to finally become, in a later stage, human beings, and the Christian understanding of human beings created in the image and likeness of God? Once again, the Pope calls us back to Pius XII for a possible explanation. He's not endorsing this one, but he's giving it as a possibility. He says, Pius XII underlined the essential point. If the origin of the human body comes through living matter which existed previously, the spiritual soul is created directly by God. So, even if there was an evolutionary process that gave us our natural physical selves, it was God himself who created the soul and planted that soul in a human being. How might we understand this? Well, going back to Pius XII, it seems that he was holding something like the implanted soul theory. And basically that is this: among all of the creatures that lived at that time, Homo erectus, there were two selected, Adam and Eve, by God to speak with him with a familiarity that the Bible associates with the beginning of our species. It could have happened in two different ways. Either an embryo or a full-grown primate received that first human soul. So it could be that as embryos, Adam and Eve, being Homo erectus, received a human soul, became fully human beings. Or it could have been that as adults, God simply implanted a soul into them and they became a living being, as the creation stories say. Once this happened, then, they were humans. They could choose to accept God or reject God. They had a moral, self-reflective capacity that exceeded what they were before and was of a different kind than what they had before. They had a religious capacity that now was capable of relating to God and to others in a religious and not just natural way. And it's here then that sin could enter into the world because now they were responsible for moral choice. It's this way that Pius XII, it seems, suggests that human beings could be in the image and likeness of God and also be evolved from animals that came before. The gradual process of the human nature, the implantation of the human soul by God to give the human being an eternal relationship with God and a capacity for having moral and religious kinds of judgment. Of course, Pius XII wasn't claiming that is what happened. He's simply posing it as one possibility, one way of thinking about the relationship that would be fully in accord with evolutionary theory and fully in accord with Christian faith. Since 1996, it seems to me that the theory of evolution has even more evidence behind it, and it's led to some rather remarkable and amazing discoveries that have benefited human existence. Maybe the foremost among those is the Human Genome Project that finished in 2003. It showed with precision the structure of the genetic code. It showed a great similarity between human beings and their animal ancestors, and it showed relationships with human beings in such a way that DNA could be utilized by forensic labs for solving of crime, for identification of relatives, and that sort of thing. Francis Collins was the head of the Human Genome Project. Francis Collins himself is a Christian. He was an atheist in his younger days, became a Christian, and as a Christian ran this project. This is his book, The Language of God. A scientist presents evidence for belief, and he shows the compatibility between evolutionary theory, the development of genetic coding, and the evidence for God. It seems to me that it's a great challenge and great responsibility today for theologians to think through the findings of this scientific theory of evolution along with the essence of Christian faith, being sure that they don't give up essential parts of Christian faith, but also that they're able to incorporate the truth claims that are found in other areas and scientific research and philosophical research and psychological research. Wherever truth is found, Christian theologians have a responsibility and an opportunity to incorporate that in, to understand that truth, taking it captive in Christ and understanding it in light of Christ.